December 15, 1944. Italian tank commander Giuseppe Martinelli stared in disbelief at the American shipping manifest in his hands, his voice trembling as he read aloud. 5,777 M24 Chaffee cruiser tanks produced this year alone. While his entire Italian tank battalion had struggled with just 12 aging M1340s that constantly broke down, the Americans were casually scrapping thousands of obsolete Sherman tanks to make room for newer models. The man who had fought across North Africa believing in Axis superiority suddenly realized they hadn't been fighting an army. They had been fighting the entire industrial might of a continent that could outproduce them 200 to 1. As Martinelli watched American guards serve ice cream to tank crews while Italian factories back home couldn't even produce enough steel for rifle barrels, everything he thought he knew about power, war, and his own nation's capabilities crumbled in an instant. But here's what will shock you most. What did this captured Italian officer discover about American industrial capacity that made him realize the war was lost before it even began? And how did this revelation completely transform Italy's post-war future? But here's what will shock you most. What did this captured Italian officer discover about American industrial capacity that made him realize the war was lost before it even began? And how did this revelation completely transform Italy's post-war future? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The scorching North African sun beat down on the rocky desert outside Tunis in March 1943, turning the metal of Italian tanks into burning ovens that could cook a man alive. Capitano Giuseppe Martinelli wiped the sweat from his forehead as he climbed out of his M1340 tank, the same machine he had driven across Ethiopia and into the mountains of Greece. The tank looked tired, just like everything else in the Italian army. Paint peeled off its sides like sunburned skin, and black smoke poured from its engine whenever they pushed it too hard. Martinelli had grown up in Turin, where his father worked in the Fiat factory before the war. He remembered watching the workers build cars one at a time, each man doing his small part with careful hands. The factory made maybe 30 cars each month, and everyone in the neighborhood felt proud of that number. When the war started, the same factory began making tanks instead of cars. But instead of 30 tanks, they could only make 3 or 4 each month. The steel was harder to get, the workers were tired, and the machines kept breaking down. Standing next to Martinelli was Tenente Marco Rossi, a young officer who had studied cars and engines before the war began. Rossi loved everything about machines. He could take apart an engine and put it back together with his eyes closed. But even Rossi looked worried as he stared at their small group of 12 tanks spread across the desert. Black smoke came from half of them, and 2 had already broken down completely. The mechanics worked day and night, but they never had enough parts to fix everything. Sergente Antonio Bianchi crawled out from under one of the broken tanks, his uniform covered in oil and dirt. Bianchi had worked on tanks since the war started, and he knew every bolt and screw in the Italian machines. His hands were always dirty, and his pockets were full of small metal pieces he had saved from broken equipment. Nothing could be wasted. When a tank died, Bianchi would strip it down and use every piece to keep the other tanks running. Sometimes he used wood from ammunition boxes to patch holes in the armor. Sometimes he used wire from old radios to fix the electrical systems. The food situation was getting worse every day. The Italian soldiers ate the same thin soup for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Sometimes they found a little meat floating in the broth, but most days it was just water with a few vegetables. Back home in Italy, their families were eating even less. The government had taken all the metal pots and pans to make weapons. Children went to school hungry, and mothers waited in long lines for bread that often ran out before their turn came. Martinelli looked at his watch and saw that it was almost time for the morning radio report. Every day, the officers had to tell their commanders how many tanks were still working. Today, the answer was 8 tanks out of 12. Yesterday, it was 9. The numbers kept getting smaller, but the enemy seemed to have more machines every time they met in battle. The radio crackled to life with news from the front lines. American forces had landed in North Africa and were pushing forward with hundreds of tanks. Martinelli had heard these reports before, but he always thought they were exaggerated. No army could have hundreds of tanks, he told himself. It was impossible. His own regiment had started with 40 tanks 6 months ago, and now they were down to 12 working machines. How could the Americans have so many when Italy, with all its factories and steel mills, could barely keep a dozen tanks running? Rossi picked up his binoculars and looked toward the horizon where dust clouds were growing larger. Something big was moving out there, something much bigger than their small group of Italian tanks. The ground began to vibrate under their feet like thunder that never stopped. The vibration got stronger and stronger, making small stones jump and dance on the desert sand. Then they saw them. American Sherman tanks, not just a few, but dozens of them, spread across the desert like a metal flood. The Shermans looked fresh and new, with bright paint that had not yet been burned off by the desert sun. Their engines purred like well-fed cats, not like the coughing, smoking Italian machines. Behind the Shermans came trucks carrying fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, more trucks than Martinelli had ever seen in his life. Bianchi dropped his wrench and stared at the approaching American force. He counted the tanks once, then counted them again, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. There were more American tanks in this one group than Italy had built in the past 6 months. More trucks than he had seen in his entire military career. The Americans seemed to have an endless supply of everything, while the Italians saved every bolt and scrap of metal like precious jewels. The battle that followed was over before it really began. Italian shells bounced off the American armor like pebbles thrown at a wall, while American guns punched through Italian tanks like they were made of paper. Within an hour, half of Martinelli's remaining tanks were burning wrecks scattered across the desert sand. The survivors, including Martinelli, Rossi, and Bianchi, found themselves surrounded by more American soldiers than they could count. As American medics treated the wounded and guards organized the prisoners, Martinelli looked around in stunned silence. The Americans moved with calm efficiency, like workers in a well-run factory. They had enough bandages for everyone, enough water for all the prisoners, and enough food to feed an army twice their size. Everything the Italians had struggled to find, the Americans seemed to have in abundance. The truck ride to the American prisoner camp took 3 hours, and during every minute of that journey, Martinelli watched an endless parade of American military equipment roll past in the opposite direction. Convoys of brand-new Sherman tanks stretched as far as he could see, their treads still shiny with fresh grease. Behind them came trucks loaded with spare parts, followed by more trucks carrying ammunition, then fuel tankers, then mobile repair shops that looked better equipped than any Italian factory he had ever seen. Every few minutes another convoy would pass, and Martinelli would count the vehicles until he lost track of the numbers. The prisoner camp sat next to a large American supply depot that buzzed with activity day and night. Through the wire fence, the Italian prisoners could see American soldiers unloading crates from trains that seemed to arrive every hour. Mountains of supplies grew taller each day, reaching heights that blocked out the sun in some areas of the depot. Cases of ammunition were stacked like building blocks, each pile containing more shells than Martinelli's entire regiment had fired during their 6 months in North Africa. On their third day in the camp, the Americans assigned work details to keep the prisoners busy. Rossi found himself working in the supply depot, helping American clerks organize shipping papers and inventory lists. His job was simple: carry papers from one office to another and help count supplies. But what he saw in those papers made his hands shake as he held them. One shipping manifest listed 847 M4 Sherman tanks delivered to North Africa in just the past month. Another paper showed 1,243 trucks arriving the same week. A third document detailed spare parts: 15,000 tank engines, 45,000 sets of tracks, and 89,000 sets of tank wheels. Rossi stared at the numbers until his eyes hurt. His mind kept trying to make sense of what he was reading, but the figures seemed impossible. The entire Italian tank force in North Africa had never had more than 200 tanks at any one time, and most of those were broken or breaking down. Yet here was proof that the Americans had delivered over 800 brand new tanks in just 30 days. Not repaired tanks, not rebuilt tanks, but fresh machines straight from American factories. During his lunch break, Rossi walked past the American motor pool and saw something that made him stop and rub his eyes to make sure he was not dreaming. American mechanics were pulling perfectly good engines out of Sherman tanks and throwing them onto a scrap pile. When Rossi asked one of the mechanics why they were throwing away engines that looked almost new, the American soldier laughed and said they were replacing 6-month-old engines with newer models that had better performance. 6 months was older than most Italian tanks ever lived before breaking down completely. Bianchi got assigned to work with the American maintenance crews, and what he witnessed there challenged everything he thought he knew about fixing machines. The American mechanics had separate tools for every job, clean work areas with bright electric lights, and enough spare parts to build entirely new tanks from scratch. When an American tank broke down, the mechanics did not try to patch it with wood and wire like Bianchi had been doing for years. Instead, they simply replaced the broken part with a brand new one from their massive supply of spares. The American mess hall served meals that made the Italian prisoners feel like they were dreaming. Breakfast included real eggs, thick slices of bacon, fresh bread with butter, and coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of burnt grain. Lunch brought thick sandwiches made with meat that the Italians had not tasted in over a year, along with fresh vegetables and milk that came from actual cows. But dinner was the meal that truly amazed them. The Americans served portions so large that most Italian prisoners could not finish everything on their plates, followed by desserts that included real sugar and sometimes even ice cream. Ice cream in the middle of a desert war seemed like magic to men who had not tasted sugar in months. The Americans had trucks that carried ice cream makers powered by gasoline engines that ran continuously to keep the dessert frozen. Martinelli watched American tank crews eating ice cream while sitting on their machines between battles, treating this luxury like it was as common as drinking water. Meanwhile, Italian soldiers back home were mixing sawdust with flour to make their bread last longer. One afternoon, a convoy of red trucks arrived at the depot, each one decorated with the words Coca-Cola painted in flowing white letters. The trucks carried thousands of bottles of the sweet, fizzy drink that American soldiers seemed to consume like water. Martinelli had heard of Coca-Cola before the war, but had never tasted it. When an American guard offered him a bottle, the sweet, cold liquid seemed to represent everything that was different between America and Italy. The Americans had factories that could make millions of bottles of a drink that served no military purpose just because their soldiers enjoyed the taste. Meanwhile, Italian soldiers back home were mixing sawdust with flour to make their bread last longer. One afternoon, a convoy of red trucks arrived at the depot, each one decorated with the words Coca-Cola painted in flowing white letters. The trucks carried thousands of bottles of the sweet, fizzy drink that American soldiers seemed to consume like water. Martinelli had heard of Coca-Cola before the war, but had never tasted it. When an American guard offered him a bottle, the sweet, cold liquid seemed to represent everything that was different between America and Italy. The Americans had factories that could make millions of bottles of a drink that served no military purpose just because their soldiers enjoyed the taste. As the days passed, Martinelli began to understand that what he was seeing was not just abundance, but a completely different way of thinking about war and production. The Americans did not carefully save every bolt and scrap of metal like the Italians did. Instead, they built so many new things that they could afford to throw away anything that was not perfect. Their factories back home produced so much equipment that frontline soldiers could be wasteful without affecting the war effort. Rossi started keeping a secret diary where he wrote down all the production numbers he saw in the American papers. Each night, he would add up the figures and compare them to what he remembered about Italian production. The numbers told a story that frightened him. American factories were producing more tanks in 1 month than Italy produced in an entire year. American steel mills made more metal in 1 week than Italian mills made in 6 months. The war was not just a battle between armies, Rossi realized, but a contest between two completely different industrial systems, and Italy had entered a fight it could never win. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. November 23, 1944 arrived grey and cold at the prisoner camp, but something felt different in the air. American guards moved through the compound with unusual energy, setting up long tables in the main courtyard and hanging decorations that looked like autumn leaves made of paper. When Martinelli asked what was happening, Sergeant Williams, the camp's head guard, smiled and said it was Thanksgiving Day, the most important holiday for American families. What happened next would change everything Martinelli thought he knew about his captors and their country. The American cooks had been working since before dawn, preparing a feast that filled the entire camp with smells that made every prisoner's mouth water. Roasted turkey, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, fresh bread, green beans, and pumpkin pie covered tables that stretched across the courtyard like a small village made of food. But the most shocking moment came when Sergeant Williams, the camp's head guard, smiled and said it was Thanksgiving Day, the most important holiday for American families. What happened next would change everything Martinelli thought he knew about his captors and their country. The American cooks had been working since before dawn, preparing a feast that filled the entire camp with smells that made every prisoner's mouth water. Roasted turkey, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, fresh bread, green beans, and pumpkin pie covered tables that stretched across the courtyard like a small village made of food. But the most shocking moment came when Sergeant Williams stood up and announced that all Italian prisoners were invited to join the American soldiers for the meal, not as captives eating scraps, but as guests sitting at the same tables. Martinelli sat between 2 American tank commanders, men who just months earlier would have been shooting at him across a battlefield. The turkey on his plate was larger than any piece of meat he had eaten in the past 2 years. The sweet potatoes tasted like candy, and the cranberry sauce was so rich and flavorful that he had to close his eyes and savor each bite. Around him, American soldiers were laughing and telling stories about their families back home, treating the Italian prisoners like old friends rather than enemies who had tried to kill them. During the meal, Captain Johnson, the camp commander, stood up to give a speech about what Thanksgiving meant to Americans. He talked about being grateful for abundance, for freedom, and for the ability to share good things with others, even with people who had once been enemies. As Martinelli listened, he realized that the food on this single table was better and more plentiful than what Italian officers had eaten during their best meals in Rome before the war. The Americans were feeding their prisoners better than Italy had fed its own military leaders. After dinner, the Americans set up a movie projector and showed the Italian prisoners newsreels from American factories. The black and white images flickered on a white sheet hung between two poles, but what those images showed was more powerful than any bomb or bullet. Martinelli watched footage of the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run factory, where workers assembled B-24 bombers on a moving line that stretched for over a mile. The narrator's voice explained that this single factory produced one complete bomber every hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The numbers hit Martinelli like physical blows to his chest. One factory producing 24 bombers every day meant 168 bombers every week, which meant over 8,000 bombers every year from just one building. Italy's entire aircraft industry had never built 8,000 planes in its entire history. But this was just one American factory, and the newsreel showed dozens of similar facilities across the United States, each one producing tanks, trucks, ships, or aircraft at impossible speeds. Rossi sat in the front row, furiously scribbling notes in his secret diary as the newsreels continued. The film showed the Chrysler tank arsenal in Detroit, where workers assembled Sherman tanks on assembly lines that moved like rivers of steel. The factory produced 25 tanks every single day, which meant 750 tanks each month from this one location alone. Rossi's hands shook as he wrote down the numbers, knowing that 750 tanks per month was more than Italy's total tank production for the entire war. The most devastating moment came when the newsreel showed statistics comparing American production to the rest of the world. In 1943, American factories had built 29,497 tanks, 85,433 aircraft, 2,654 naval vessels, and 434,000 trucks. The numbers appeared on the screen in large white letters that seemed to burn themselves into Martinelli's memory. Italy, Germany, and Japan combined had not produced half of what America built in just that 1 year. That night, Martinelli lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Everything he had believed about the war, about his country's strength, about America's supposed weakness, crumbled like a house made of sand. The propaganda posters back home had shown Americans as soft, lazy people who couldn't fight or work hard. But the evidence of his own eyes told a completely different story. The Americans had built the largest industrial machine in human history, and they had done it while maintaining a way of life that gave ice cream to soldiers and turkey dinners to prisoners. In his diary, Rossi wrote words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. December 15, 1944. Today I learned that Ford Motor Company alone produces more vehicles in 1 month than all of Italy's factories combined in a year. We were not fighting an army, we were fighting an entire continent that had turned itself into one giant factory. How did we ever think we could win this war? How did our leaders not know what we were up against? Bianchi found himself thinking about his village back home, where his wife and children were probably eating soup made from potato peels and tree bark. Meanwhile, he had just finished a meal that included 3 different kinds of meat, fresh vegetables, and real sugar in his coffee. The contrast was not just about food, but about 2 completely different worlds. One world where people fought over scraps and saved every piece of metal, and another world where abundance was so common that people could afford to be generous to their enemies. The transformation was not just about understanding American capacity, but about recognizing what that capacity represented. These were not just numbers on paper, but the result of millions of free people choosing to work together toward a common goal. No dictator had forced American workers to build those tanks and planes. No secret police had threatened American farmers to grow that food. The abundance came from a system where people worked hard because they believed in what they were building, not because they feared punishment for refusing. Martinelli realized that everything he had been taught about power was wrong. Real power did not come from fear, propaganda, or military parades. Real power comes from the ability to convince free people to work together, to build together, and to sacrifice together for something they believed was worth protecting. The Americans had not just outproduced the Axis powers, they had out-organized them, out-motivated them, and out-inspired them. As the weeks passed after Thanksgiving, Martinelli found himself seeing everything differently. When American guards shared their cigarettes with Italian prisoners, it was not weakness, but confidence. When American mechanics threw away perfectly good parts to install newer ones, it was not waste, but abundance. When American soldiers laughed and joked even during serious work, it was not lack of discipline, but the behavior of free men who chose to be there.
The ideological collapse was complete, but what replaced it was not despair, but a kind of wonder. Martinelli had discovered that the world was much larger and more complex than he had ever imagined, and that his small corner of it had been living under ideas that were not just wrong, but tragically small compared to what was possible when human beings truly worked together. The train carrying Italian prisoners back to their homeland pulled into Turin's central station on a cold morning in February 1946. Martinelli pressed his face against the dirty window and felt his heart sink as he saw his city for the first time since leaving for North Africa 3 years earlier. The beautiful buildings he remembered were now broken shells with gaping holes where bombs had torn through walls. Twisted metal beams stuck out of collapsed roofs like broken bones, and piles of rubble filled the streets where children had once played. The contrast hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Just 6 months earlier, he had been eating Thanksgiving dinner at an American prison camp, where even the prisoners lived better than most Italian civilians had lived before the war. Now he stood in the ruins of his own city, breathing air that still smelled of smoke and destruction, walking on streets covered with broken glass that crunched under his worn-out boots like snow that would never melt. Martinelli's small apartment building had survived the bombing, but barely. Half the roof was gone, and his third-floor window was covered with boards instead of glass. He climbed the dark stairway, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway, carrying a heavy bag filled with things he had brought back from America. Inside that bag were technical manuals about tank production, organizational charts showing how American factories worked, and pages of notes he had copied from supply documents during his time as a prisoner. His wife Anna opened the door and barely recognized the man standing before her. Martinelli had left Italy as a proud officer who believed in his country's strength and destiny. He returned as someone who had seen a different world and could never unsee what he had learned. Anna looked thinner than he remembered, her clothes patched and repatched, her hands rough from working in factories during the war. But her eyes still held the same love that had kept him alive through the darkest days of captivity. During his first dinner at home, Martinelli stared at the thin soup and small piece of bread that Anna had prepared with great care. The meal was exactly like the food he had eaten as a prisoner before being captured, but now it seemed impossibly small compared to the abundance he had witnessed in America. He thought about American soldiers eating ice cream in the desert while his own family had spent 3 years rationing sugar into tiny portions that lasted for weeks. Over the following weeks, Martinelli, Rossi, and Bianchi met regularly in a small cafe that had reopened after the bombing. They would sit for hours, sharing stories about what they had seen and trying to make sense of how it might change Italy's future. Rossi had brought back detailed sketches of American assembly line methods, drawings that showed how one factory could produce hundreds of vehicles every month by organizing work in completely new ways. Rossi found work at the Fiat factory, the same place where Martinelli's father had worked before the war.
But instead of trying to rebuild the old system of slow, careful production, Rossi began teaching the Italian workers about American methods he had observed during his captivity. He showed them how moving assembly lines could increase production by 10 times, how standardized parts could make repairs faster and cheaper, and how treating workers with respect could make them more productive than fear and punishment ever could. The changes came slowly at first, but within 2 years, the Fiat factory was producing more cars than it had ever built before the war. Italian engineers, who had once thought that building 10 tanks per month was a remarkable achievement, now understood how American factories could build hundreds. The knowledge that Rossi and others brought back from their time as prisoners became the foundation for Italy's post-war industrial recovery. Bianchi opened a technical school in his neighborhood, teaching young Italian mechanics about American maintenance methods. Instead of the old Italian way of trying to fix everything with whatever materials were available, Bianchi taught his students about preventive maintenance, quality control, and the importance of having proper tools and spare parts. His school became so popular that students traveled from other cities to learn these new methods. But the changes went deeper than just industrial techniques. Martinelli became a strong supporter of Italy joining NATO and accepting help from the Marshall Plan. When other Italians complained about accepting American aid, Martinelli would tell them stories about American abundance, about prisoners being fed better than Italian officers, about factories that produced more in 1 month than Italy had built in entire years. The mental transformation was the most profound change of all. These men had returned from captivity with a completely different understanding of what made countries strong. They had learned that real power came not from military parades or propaganda speeches, but from the ability to organize free people to work together toward common goals. They had seen that prosperity was not a zero-sum game, where one nation's success requires another's failure, but something that could grow when people were allowed to be creative and productive. 10 years after returning from America, Martinelli stood in the rebuilt Fiat factory, watching Italian workers using American-inspired methods to build tanks for NATO, the military alliance that now included both Italy and the United States as partners instead of enemies. The factory floor buzzed with efficiency that would have been impossible under the old Italian system, and the workers moved with the kind of purposeful energy that Martinelli had first observed in American prison camps. As he watched a new M47 Patton tank roll off the assembly line, built by Italian hands using American techniques, Martinelli reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. The tank was being built for an army that would fight alongside Americans instead of against them, using production methods that Italian prisoners had learned while being treated better than they had ever been treated by their own government.
The transformation extended beyond the 3 officers to their families and communities. Anna, Martinelli's wife, had learned to read during the war years while working in a munitions factory. When her husband returned with stories about American women working as engineers and managers, she decided to pursue an education that had been impossible before the war. She enrolled in evening classes and eventually became one of Italy's first female industrial supervisors, applying organizational principles that Martinelli had learned from watching American efficiency. Their son Michele grew up hearing bedtime stories about American abundance instead of fairy tales about kingdoms and dragons. When Michele reached school age, he could recite production statistics about American factories the way other children memorize nursery rhymes. This early exposure to American industrial thinking shaped his approach to problem solving and innovation. By age 20, Michele had started his own small manufacturing company that specialized in precision tools, using quality control methods his father had described from American production lines. Ross's impact on Italian automotive design became legendary throughout Europe. The techniques he brought back from observing American assembly lines revolutionized not just Fiat, but influenced automotive manufacturers across the continent. French and German engineers visited Turin to study the American methods that Italian factories had adapted and improved upon. What had started as lessons learned in a prisoner of war camp became the foundation for European industrial recovery and eventual prosperity. The social changes were equally profound. Bianchi's technical school grew from a small neighborhood workshop into a network of training centers across northern Italy. His students became the skilled workforce that powered Italy's economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s. These men and women carried forward not just technical knowledge, but a philosophy of work that emphasized collaboration over hierarchy, innovation over tradition, and merit over social class. The ripple effects reached into unexpected corners of Italian society. Local restaurants began serving larger portions after hearing stories about American abundance, even when ingredients were still scarce. Italian farmers started experimenting with American agricultural techniques that Bianchi had observed at the prison camp, where American cooks had access to vegetables grown using methods that produced 3 times more food per acre than traditional Italian farming. Church leaders found themselves grappling with theological questions raised by the stories these men told. If God blessed nations with abundance, why had Italy suffered while America prospered? The answer that emerged from countless sermons and discussions was not about divine favoritism, but about human systems that either encouraged or discouraged the full development of human potential. This theological shift contributed to the Catholic Church's eventual support for democratic institutions and market economies throughout post-war Europe. The educational system underwent gradual but fundamental changes as veterans like Martinelli became teachers and administrators. Italian schools began emphasizing practical skills alongside classical education, introducing concepts of teamwork and project-based learning that reflected American approaches to problem solving. Students learned to question authority in constructive ways, rather than simply accepting traditional answers, preparing them for a world where innovation would matter more than obedience. Women's roles in Italian society shifted dramatically as stories spread about American women working in factories, driving trucks, and managing complex operations while their men fought overseas. Anna's journey from housewife to industrial supervisor inspired thousands of other Italian women to pursue careers that had been unimaginable before the war. By 1955, Italy had one of the highest rates of female participation in technical education in Europe, directly traced to the influence of returning prisoners who had witnessed American gender equality in action. The political implications were enormous. Italy's decision to join NATO and embrace the Marshall Plan was influenced heavily by veterans who had experienced American generosity firsthand. When communist politicians argued that Americans were imperialist exploiters, men like Martinelli could respond with personal testimony about being treated with dignity and respect by their captors. This grassroots advocacy for Atlantic partnership helped anchor Italy firmly in the Western Alliance during the crucial years of the Cold War. Regional development patterns changed as knowledge spread from the industrial north to the agricultural south. Bianchi's students opened technical schools in Sicily and Calabria, bringing modern production methods to areas that had been isolated from industrial progress for centuries. Southern Italian communities that had survived on subsistence agriculture began producing manufactured goods for export, using organizational principles derived from American factory management. The psychological transformation proved to be the most lasting legacy. Generations of Italians grew up hearing stories about a country where abundance was normal rather than exceptional, where waste indicated prosperity rather than moral failure, where innovation was rewarded rather than discouraged. This mental shift from scarcity thinking to abundance thinking became embedded in Italian culture and contributed to the nation's remarkable economic growth in the decades following the war.
By 1960, 15 years after the prisoners' return, Italy had become one of the world's fastest-growing economies. The Italian economic miracle that astonished international observers was built on foundations laid by men who had learned about modern production methods while eating turkey dinners in American prison camps. Factories that had once struggled to produce a handful of vehicles each month were now competing successfully in global markets, exporting Italian-made goods around the world.
The irony was not lost on thoughtful observers that Italy's greatest military defeat had led to its greatest peacetime triumph. The knowledge gained through capture and imprisonment had proven more valuable than any victory on the battlefield could have been. American industrial methods, freely shared with former enemies, had created prosperity that benefited both nations far more than continued conflict ever could have achieved. International business relationships flourished as Italian companies established partnerships with American firms. Executives who had once tried to kill each other now worked together on joint ventures that created wealth and employment on both sides of the Atlantic. The personal relationships formed in prison camps evolved into professional networks that facilitated technology transfer and cultural exchange for decades. Scientific cooperation emerged as Italian engineers and American technicians shared knowledge that advanced both nations' capabilities. Research projects that combined Italian creativity with American resources produced innovations in automotive design, manufacturing processes, and quality control systems. Universities in both countries established exchange programs that allowed students to study the industrial methods that had proven so effective in practice. Cultural exchanges deepened understanding between former enemies. Italian families began celebrating Thanksgiving as a gesture of gratitude for American friendship, while American communities with large Italian populations incorporated traditional Italian festivals into their annual celebrations. These cultural connections reinforced the political and economic ties that had grown from the relationships formed during wartime captivity. The children and grandchildren of former prisoners became ambassadors of American-Italian friendship. They carried forward stories about generosity shown to defeated enemies, about abundance shared with those who had nothing, about respect given to those who had no power to demand it. These family narratives became part of Italian national memory and helped explain why Italy remained one of America's most reliable allies throughout the Cold War and beyond. Medical care improved dramatically as Italian doctors learned about American approaches to public health and hospital administration. Veterans who had received medical treatment in American prison camps brought back knowledge about preventative medicine, sanitation standards, and patient care that revolutionized Italian healthcare. Hospitals that had operated more like medieval infirmaries were transformed into modern medical facilities that served as models for other European nations. Urban planning reflected American influences as Italian cities rebuilt from wartime destruction. Wide streets designed for automotive traffic replaced narrow medieval lanes. Suburbs developed around shopping centers rather than traditional piazzas. And industrial zones were separated from residential areas using zoning concepts borrowed from American city planning. These changes reflected a fundamental shift in how Italians thought about space, movement, and the relationship between work and home life. Environmental awareness emerged earlier in Italy than in many other European countries, partly because veterans had observed American conservation practices during their captivity. Forestry management, soil conservation, and water resource planning incorporated techniques that American authorities had used to maintain prison camp facilities and surrounding areas. This early environmental consciousness contributed to Italy's leadership in renewable energy development decades later. In his final diary entry, written 30 years after his return from America, Martinelli captured the lesson that had taken him a lifetime to fully understand.
We thought we were fighting soldiers, but we were fighting factories. We thought we were battling armies, but we were battling an entire way of life. In that American prison camp, I did not just learn about tanks, I learned about the power of a free society to organize itself for survival. Those 5,777 tanks were not just machines, they were democracy in steel, and they taught us that the future belonged not to those who could force people to work, but to those who could inspire them to build something better together. The greatest victory was not won on any battlefield, but in the moment when former enemies chose to share their abundance with those who had lost everything, proving that human dignity transcends the temporary madness of war. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.